I'm beginning to get a bit dead. There we go, Evan Harris. Dr. Evan Harris, who you know very well, is a fantastic campaigner on all sorts of rights issues, and I have to say, very sadly, lost to the Commons for the time being. Sunder Katwala of the Fabian Society, and John Leech MP for Manchester Withington, and David Blunkett, who you know too well for me to give any description of. And I'm going to start off. Too well. We're going to start off, each of them is going to speak for about 3 minutes each on this extremely hot topic, and I'm very glad we've got a cross-party group here. Is the Lib Lab coalition gone forever? Is the dream of uniting what used to be called the left gone forever? So, David, would you like to kick off?
Well, I think the first thing for those of us in the Labour Party is to get our own coalition together before we set about doing the future one with the Lib Dems, and I think we should do that as from now. The second is that there's a big challenge for us to think through what the purpose of politics is, and therefore how we would deal with a situation where no party had an overall majority. And I have to say that the use of the alternative vote, of the system we use for the leadership ballot, has made me think quite deeply about this, and I think we need to examine, if we go for AB, precisely what form we use and how we do it, so that we don't end up, this is not anything to do with who actually won, because it would have been just the same if David Blunkett had beaten his brother, that we don't end up with a situation where BNP and UKIP second votes count as much as the first votes of those who have their heads screwed on. The third thing I wanted to say was that I've been painted by one or two of my senior colleagues as being the person who pretty much called the plug with John Reid on the possibility of a Labour Lib Dem coalition on May the 7th to May the 11th. And that is just not true. My point, and I made it at 3:15 on the Friday morning, and again at the conclusion of the count at 5:15, was we didn't have the arithmetic, and that was self-evident, and we didn't have the legitimacy, which again was self-evident, because we'd lost 91 seats, and we'd only got 29% of the vote, which was only 1.5% more than we got in 83. So on both counts, one practical and the other democratic, we didn't have the mandate or the arithmetic to do it. If we'd won another 30 seats, I would have been in favour of us trying to put together a progressive alliance with the Liberal Democrats, much as it would have pained me, because in politics, actually being in power, being able to do things, being able to defend people, is what it's all about. Now, the third question we were asked to address about, seeing I've only got 3 minutes, was is it possible to build a progressive alliance outside Leech? But again, I come back to what is it we're trying to achieve. I think that David Cameron, this has not been debated anywhere as far as I'm aware, I think that David Cameron and the people around him had actually thought through what they were going to do if they didn't have an overall majority. And it's patently obvious that we haven't. Yeah. And I don't even think, I know John Evan could touch on this, whether the Lib Dem leadership had actually thought it through. I think we should think through now how we can coalesce, not just with Liberal Democrats who want to stay Lib Dems as opposed to joining us, but with Lib Dems who want to stay in the party, Greens who want to stay in their party, people of goodwill who are joining politics for the first time, in terms of how you can have major disagreements on issues and still pull together on other issues. This could be very difficult in a city like Sheffield, where the Lib Dems hold temporarily a very slim majority, but where on election day I'd asked the then leader of the current leader of the council, Paul Scriven, to join with us. This was an offer, not a rejection, to join with us on defending the city and protecting us from what was obviously going to be enormous cuts. And I think we should work out a way, big politics, big thinking, maturity, in terms of when we can work together and when we can't. And I think that would be a very interesting way of broadening the genuine coalition outside Parliament to protect people, but also to promote progressive values and the prevention of the scorched earth policy, which will destroy everything that we've tried to build up.
Thanks very much. Evan Harris next.
Thanks. So it's impressive skill to keep to 3 minutes on such a big topic, and there'll be a lot that hasn't been said. I think it's important to recognise what David just said there, because there was the presumption, and I had the presumption actually after the election when I picked myself off the floor several times, which was that there was an option for the Liberal Democrats, and notionally there were 3 options. But the one option, and in fact there were only 2, because the option of a rainbow alliance wasn't there on the arithmetic, and I'm glad to hear that David was saying that his objection on the radio was due to a recognition that the arithmetic wasn't there, because it's difficult enough for a Labour Party that had lost and wasn't used to working, found it very difficult actually in my experience to work even on issues that they had in common with the Liberal Democrats, and probably know some of the issues I tried to work with them on, to accept that they would have to work with someone else. And also a more rational response from Labour was to renew in opposition. So I perfectly understand the mentality of not wanting to do that, especially having to stitch something together with the nationalists as well, which would have been extremely difficult. So given that the arithmetic was difficult and multi-party, and that there were some, perhaps, who felt even more strongly than David and John Reid that this wasn't for the Labour Party, that wasn't an option. So there were 2 options. So at that point, once Gordon Brown recognised that there wasn't going to be a Labour deal, and he left to see the Queen, David Cameron was the Prime Minister, and there were 2 options. A minority Conservative government, sustained through abstention on the Queen's speech and the budget by the Liberal Democrats, or a coalition where there would be, we would argue, a dilution of what would otherwise be available and offered to the country. Now, you can look at the coalition agreement and you can make a judgment, but I think there's 2 things that the Labour Party need to understand if they want to, well, 3 things, that there may well be a hung parliament in the future, with or without AV. And in fact, I don't think the country will see a hung parliament as a recipe for chaos, because the one thing it hasn't been after those first few days is chaotic. It's been ordered, and it's been in our interest to make clear that that's the case, because many of us lost our seats or failed to win our seats because of the swing back with the 2 other parties, because of fear of the hung parliament equaled chaos, equaled Greece, equaled Italy, and that's been disproven. However popular the government turns out to be, the coalition turns out to be at the next election. The second thing that needs to be, I think, understood is that if there's no recognition by Labour that some of the things the coalition have done are not as bad as what would have been delivered by the Conservatives, and that these were Liberal Democrat achievements, then what Labour is actually saying is that the protection of the Human Rights Act, the repeal of some of the anti-civil liberties legislation, we don't have to argue about that across this panel. There's a perception in much of the Labour movement that much of that some, at least, what was done in civil liberties was wrong, and in retrospect should have been avoided. If that is portrayed by the Conservatives and Labour as Conservatives, then you make the Conservatives more attractive, and the Conservatives, in most of your seats, the vast majority, is your main opposition. So it's not rational, electorally, to dismiss the Liberal Democrats' achievements on political reform, on civil liberties, and where it has occurred, such as on some of the taxation issues, capital gains tax, raising the threshold, that this is a Conservative government and the Liberal Democrats are just agreeing with Conservative policies. That is self-defeating. And thirdly, and finally, I would suggest that the attacks on the Liberal Democrats, the very strong attacks on them as a party, using terms like, oh, I don't know, behaving like every harlot in history, reference David Blunkett, or betrayal, this sort of language, actually makes people like me on the progressive side of the Liberal Democrats, which is most of the activists and the majority of the membership. We don't control who votes for us, pretty much. We can't account for them. But certainly these core people, it makes us more defensive and protective